Hello, I'm Lisa Steele, Creative Director at Vtape, and this is the lovely Kira Bolt, who will be taking over the Curatorial Incubator from me when I retire at the end of this year. Welcome to the conversation between Connor Wilkes and some of the artists in his Curatorial Incubator program across the escarpment that you've just viewed. Over to you, Connor.
Hey, everybody.
Hello.
I'd just like to start off by saying thank you for taking the time out of your day to take part in this little chat that we're having. I just wanted to reiterate what I sent out in my email the other day. I'm hoping that this interview, my program, and the paper that I wrote can be used as a primer for people interested in the escarpment school. The theme of the Vtape program this year was learning from the local, and I chose the escarpment school for a few reasons. One of the reasons is that I'm interested in Canadian cinema and nonfiction film, and I simply wanted to know a little bit more about the escarpment school. I was also shocked at how little the escarpment school as a whole appears in Canadian cinema studies. And I was also interested in film co-ops, hand processing film, and as well as growing up in the Niagara and Hamilton region. The escarpment was basically in my backyard my whole life. I thought this would be a good exercise for me to learn a few new things. So I guess I wanted to kind of start the conversation off, kind of getting your perspectives on your processes of your films. And then maybe if we have time, we can get into the escarpment school maybe a little bit more generally. So these first few questions are kind of addressed to all of you. The first question I had, I chose On the Pond, Canal, and Waterworx for this program because of their relation to specific times and places from your childhood. Could you describe what these places mean to you and why you chose to return to them? And then maybe a follow-up to that would be, how did returning to these locations with a film camera impact your relation to the area?
Well, in my case, I made the film Waterworx, which is actually the location of the Harris water filtration plant at the east end of Queen Street in Toronto, because it was a significant landscape when I was born. I was born in Toronto, and so was my father. We both lived on Neville Park Boulevard, which is the end of the Queen Car line, at the foot of which is the Waterworx, where my mother would take me, I guess, in the pram and walk around when I was very young. And then we would visit my grandmother there every year. And so it always loomed down there. And I guess when I had the better skills at able to explore things artistically, like with a camera, I wanted to try to understand what it was that was so compelling about the architecture and the location of that architecture on the lake. And so I went back with a camera several times and thought about it, tried different aspects of music with it that I remember from that my mother would sing, until I started to understand a little bit more about the intersection of time and memory at that place, not just for me, but for apparently a lot of other people.
I could say something, I guess. Yeah, with On the Pond, I guess to me it was sort of the original place to go back to as a family cottage, mostly because that's where I hung out in the woods and on the lake. It was a place to go inside, and I guess that kind of introspection was important for me in all my work, I think. Also in the course at Sheridan, Rick here brought up the filmmaker writer George Semsel, and gave an article to us. The idea was that of the article was that before you make a film about the world, you should take a look at yourself. Autobiography. So instead of autobiography being at the end of your life, it's the beginning of your filmmaking, I guess.
Yeah.
But to me, that led me, into On the Pond and to deal with the family and, the family slideshow, setting that up and so on. And I think later that sort of idea continued for me in like All Fall Down and Slaughterhouse, where, like in All Fall Down, I kind of am looking at the stone house that I'm living in now out here near Mount Forest, and it makes me think about what was here before, and then that got me into thinking about Indigenous land, and so the films become kind of interested in other things other than myself.
For sure.
Okay, I'll take a go at it here. Yeah, in the context of the student films, Hawkesville and Canal, certainly Hawkesville, I mean, there's nothing profound. It was a first film. I had to choose a subject for the course. I had no money, so it had to be, whatever I did had to be practical, and also had a strong sense of what I didn't want to do. A student theatrical film, anything like that. So it had to be something, as I say, related to my life. And my life was going back to Kitchener at the time on the weekends and so forth. But beyond that, and then Canal was much the same situation, but later in life, I happened to had to go back to St. Catharines to clean up some family business, family estate stuff. And I got my first small grant. And so it allowed me a year just to revisit this place. But it was all practical. I mean, I had, it was nothing. Once again, I needed a project. It was the 150th anniversary of the Canal. I wrote a grant that looked like an NFB project. It turned out not to be that, but but more important from a filmmaking point of view, I had a sense even at that time as a young filmmaker that both of these places were practical places to start, just to eliminate all the other complications that come up in filmmaking. That one, they were permanent. They were always there. I could always go to them. Within that, there was always something new about them when I went to them, whether it was the Amish community or whether it was Canal. Then within that, from a filmmaking point of view, and probably what I had learned to that point in a year and a half of filmmaking at Sheridan, was they both had motion. They both had things to photograph. It wasn't complicated. Buggies went back and forth. Both boats went back and forth. It was, the motion was there. I just had to put the camera on a tripod. So it was a very high sense of KISS, keep it simple, stupid, and, so there's nothing profound. And as far as returning to the locations, no, there's no sentimentality really. There's, I don't think Kitchener I've ever been back to again, since then, really, in any meaningful way. Same with St. Catharines, other than last year after 40 years away. So I'm just not that, and maybe this will come up, it's Rick's saying that I've bounced off of. There's a future in my past, the Moose Jaw slogan, and I've twisted it to be there's no future in my past. So I'm just not sentimental, and maybe that's a difference between me and my two colleagues here. So is, you know, there's a kind of hard break on time, memory, all those sort of things, you know. So
For sure. Thank you. I guess my second question, specifically for the films that I chose for your program, I was wondering if you could speak to the audio that was chosen for the films. Just kind of your process in choosing what the audio would be. I know they're vastly different from the three of you. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that.
Oh, in the case of Waterworx, as I mentioned, there's some music, remember from the 40s that my mother, who was a British war bride, and my father, who was in the Air Force, that was nostalgic music for them, I guess. The White Cliffs of Dover by Vera Lynn, which is sort of an anthem of World War II. And songs like that were still playing on the radio when I was very young. I was born in 46. So I associate music from that era with some of these landscapes. And but they're so distant, so far away. I mixed snippets of Vera Lynn's song in with a radio that I had put on AM and tuned somewhere in between stations. So it created the static, and I mixed that static with the music as if it was somehow still, the sound waves were somehow from that music still bouncing around in the atmosphere, and you could pull them in with a strong enough receiver. Then in the second half of the film, it's the same, it's a repeat of the first half, except that the words come on the screen, Wallace Stevens' poem, but the music now is very much lower and quieter, even more distant, because we're going back to seeing this powerful image again, but we can't quite have it the way we had it in the first place, just like it was for me. So now the music is attenuated. The words on the screen interfere with our access to the image. So in that sense, the sound and the music went together.
I guess we can keep the same order. It's easy. On the pond, well, I think it starts with the Bolex. The Bolex is non-sync, so it means that you collect images and sound separately. And I think that creates right away a kind of more poetic possibility. How does the sound comment on the image, I think, is important for me in On the Pond. And I started with the family slideshow, where I put together photographs onto slides so they get the family together. I tape them while they are looking at the slides, and then, you know, that soundtrack was reconstructed into the images of the slides. But then, you know, it follows, I think, with the rest of the soundtrack, in that it, you know, the sounds are almost from inside the boy's head. So they're very loud and very crisp. And so again, you know, probably in film school, if I would have done it in video, you would just have heard the sound in the background. I probably wouldn't have jumped to this idea of, oh, I'll make the sound really loud. And I, you know, so I think the for me, learning about the Bolex also was learning about sound, and how sound might be used.
Okay. Yeah. But back to the Hawkesville and Canal, just to keep a focus. Once again, Hawkesville was a student film. You learn by falling down, sort of thing. It certainly, I would have cut the picture. We would have been instructed as a work float to cut the picture on a bench, to get it into a rough cut, maybe then start working with it on a Steenbeck. But essentially, the picture would be cut, and then that soundtrack. I mean, it's embarrassing. The soundtrack is quite embarrassing. It's sophomoric. It's a student film soundtrack. It's literal. There's, it's. I'll leave it at that. I probably had no idea about sound and image relationships at that time, other than they should be literal. And it's probably an influence of the NFB, right? Except the NFB would do it at a high, slick level, where I had, 2 hours in the mix room and, at 2 a.m, so it's and then Canal wasn't much more sophisticated, sadly to say, other than that my awareness by that time, that's like 4 years later, and I had seen a lot of films at Sheridan College by then, Ann Arbor Film Festival. The literacy level was exponential between Hawkesville and Canal. I was starting to, I was totally bought into experimental film by then, starting to take it seriously and understand it. So sound image relationships I was aware of. And so once again, I didn't want a literal soundtrack. I knew what I didn't want. I wasn't going to have an expository voiceover explaining things about the Canal. So to get to the point, what it is it's in the Sheridan sound room and a sound effects record, and it's a loop of one sound effects that lasts like 47 seconds called Dockside Activity. And I literally just recorded it manually, lifting the needle off the LP, hitting go on the mag machine, and recording it. It was 22 minutes, so I recorded it like 27 times. And I think I might have thrown I got adventurous and threw another track in there. So I had a 2-track mix. And then on a serious note, and I've struggled with it, as it were, all my life, is whether to put the blues song in. And I had another song in there, I think it was called Don't Fence Me In. But the whole idea of putting a song in at the time didn't feel right. But in the day, you would show your works in progress to colleagues and people, and it seemed, it was going to stay. I didn't have a better ending for the film. And so and still to this day, I don't know if it's the right decision, So anyway, starting to think a lot more about sound at that point.
That's great. Thank you.
Say something, because Richard's always, going against his own beauty in his work. It's like, to me, the minimal nature of the soundtrack is a beautiful thing, and lets us look at the images. And that's when I look at it now, I don't think it's a sophomoric soundtrack. It's minimal, and maybe that's like the way that Richard went with his soundtracks. They are more experimental and in that sense. Maybe by seeing so many experimental films with strange soundtracks in the course, you said, well, I'm just not going to do it the other way. So you just kind of repeated the sound. But I not to speak for you, but I just had to say that because I think you're great.
Yeah, no, yeah, well taken. And yeah.
Well,
and-
yeah, I
And
think
the point about reacting against other works you see, I think is a constant theme throughout the whole time. You know, not wanting to do what your neighbor's doing, you know.
well, yeah, I think what brings it together is Phil's point about having to work with a non-sync Bolex as opposed to video. I guess they were Portapacks at the time, in which the sound is automatically on and in sync, and you don't have to think of sound as a separate unit. This is what leads to the kinds of soundtracks that you guys made in those films. For example, Hawkesville to Wallenstein, there's an interview or there's a recording of some of the guys and the men working in the blacksmith shop. So but that's not sync. It's off screen. It's really a good part of the soundtrack. Reminds me, yes, a bit of the NFB films like Paul Tomkowitz Street Railway Switchman. In those days, they didn't use lip sync on that film, so they had to record his voice off screen. And the use of music that, I don't know if you would think, if you were using a Portapack, of using a blues song and sitting on top of a world in place of the soundtrack. When you see a canal boat going by, you just record the damn thing. But that works really, really well, I think, Richard. That song is so powerful, and you make it sound like these choices are arbitrary, but I don't think so. I think you were working very intuitively with everything that you did, and in many ways, Phil too.
Wow.
See, still the teacher, still trying to,
No,
help
I'm
my
just
students.
still the teacher, but at the other end of it, I'm a little off track, but I find sound now in terms of teaching at a film school is the most complex thing in the digital age. At one level, it's so easy with Pro Tools, so many choices, but yet, having seen a lot of work like a teacher does, there's a certain sameness about it all, and it's when I compare that to the soundtracks that we would have saw, especially in the American films, that could be just crazy, like a Robert Nelson film soundtrack, just crazy, whatever, so it's sound drives me nuts as a teacher. It's not picture, it's not digital, it's sound, as I end my teaching career.
That's great. I guess another question I had, what lasting impression has your education, or I guess employment at Sheridan College, had on you? And what did the media arts program offer you that, say, maybe a traditional film production program couldn't?
I have something to say there, because I really think that the fact that it was media arts and we learned sound, video, multi-image slideshows, and 60 millimeter film separately, all in different courses, got us to understand the seams of the media, the peculiarities and the makeup of the different possibilities. And I think that fit with our program, which had a kind of, especially in the film area, had a more experimental bent. So I think later on that really helped me a lot, not to to kind of move into different directions. I was thinking about some of Richard's films are camera related, and they get more experimental. Mine, Kitchener, Berlin, and a number of those start to get more experimental after we leave Sheridan and we're kind of well out. So it's kind of, we're resonating, it's resonating from the original moment and of learning. And I think that's because we learn, about glitches and scratches and all those things. And those are actually part of what we're looking at when we're looking at a film or a video. And I think that was an important thing for my own, development.
What is exactly the question again?
Just the lasting impression that your education at Sheridan had on you, and maybe what the media arts program offered to you, or what stood out for you in the media arts program.
I can answer this pretty quickly because it's like before this call, I spent a day sort of really analyzing this central question: Sheridan College, what was it? How did it become? Who hired the dean, then who hired the faculty? And it was, and then I put that together with my life and how did I end up even finding Sheridan College and ending up sitting in front of a guy being interviewed, and we didn't talk about anything other than car dealerships in St. Catharines, and next thing, it was all such a phenomena. And I can only put that against because I've made a career out of teaching, so I have 40 years of institutionalism to compare to my first experience at Sheridan. And and I think you have to understand the idea of being a student, making experimental films, and being a teacher, in my mind, came together very quickly there. I was teaching when I was still a student there. I was working in the cage while I was a student there. I was running a kind of a business there. It was a crazy existence, and school seemed like the least of it. Every once in a while you had to take a break and go sit and watch a movie, and you had to talk about it, and it was very serious. And, so to me, it's just, at this point in my life, I can't explain it much more than that emotionally, that it was just a phenomena that I walked into, the right situation at the right time with the right people. And I guess, not to get personal, but my life was in absolute shambles and chaos at that point. And so, I don't know, did I find a home for 2 or 3 years? Did I don't know. It all worked. I just had to flow, and I can't say enough about it. So I'll stop there.
As far as working there is concerned, I learned an awful lot about teaching. I learned about filmmaking. I was learning right along with the students. I learned from my students. I've learned a lot from Richard and Phil, and I continue to learn from them. The other thing was the freedom that we were given as teachers at Sheridan. We, unlike university now, where you have to have a syllabus, a detailed syllabus, prepared well ahead of when you start the course. Everything has to be in writing. Everything has to be planned. At Sheridan, it was just, Rick, you go away and do your thing. You do the film, and Jeff Paul, you do your thing, and we kind of closed the doors and went in there and did whatever we wanted. We just rented whatever films, showed whatever films we wanted. I mean, I did plan each class, and I had all the films figured out, but I didn't have to explain it all ahead of time, and I wasn't given any guidelines. So that's what it was like to teach there. Very different than teaching in university. And also, what was kind of interesting was, whereas in university, where I taught for many years at Concordia, your own production is your research. You're expected to do it. You're supposed to do it. At Sheridan, my own filmmaking, I wasn't required to do it. It was just something that I did anyway. And so I didn't have anybody, telling me, go and make films. I just did it because I wanted to. And I think it was also partly, as you say, Connor, the zeitgeist at the time, the coming out of the 60s, the 70s. Anyway, it was a memorable experience, very profound, and my strongest memories. And yes, very. And I think there's a spillover from that has continued for a long time. With the so-called escarpment school, it's no longer a question of shooting on the escarpment. That's just maybe the beginning of it. But Richard, Phil, and I have shot all over Canada and the U.S. So but it was the germination of something, that's for sure.
No, that's awesome.
Something, can I just add something from what you mentioned? Because that thing of it coming out of the 60s, I was there starting in the mid-70s, Richard as well. And it was kind of an experiment, in a sense, from that time. I remember the womb. There was this room, it was padded and it was round and there were just pillows all in it. And you sat in the teacher looking at you like this and, trying to figure out what you're going to make a film about. So, I mean, and I think in your article, you mentioned there were no walls. I think when it started, there were no walls, there were just beanbags, but, over the next 3-4 years from mid-70s, I think the walls started coming up, as they always do, and they did continue to come up.
Yeah. But I do have to say that and just getting back to something that Richard said about choosing the subject for his film Hawkesville, Wallenstein, and the low budget and all of that stuff, I put a lot of emphasis, and because it was partly with the way I was taught by George Sepsel, who came out of the New York underground film movement and was also made very low budget films, but also this idea of personal cinema, which came out of poetry. George was a poet, and the poems that I was familiar with, and that was a big part of my background, were of course about things you knew and things that were personal. So I would say to students that, what should I make a film about? I said, well, as the way I was taught, make a film about something about something you're familiar with. Yourself, for example, you don't have to do research. You don't have to pretend you're somebody else. You don't have to, raise mock armies or invent equipment that you don't have. Just make it simple. What do you know? What landscapes do you know? What are you familiar with? So this certainly applied to Holly Dale and Janice Cole and Ellen Zweig and so many other people. Gary Popovich, Steve Sanguidoce. Make what you know, and then the research is done. You don't have to have a huge budget, and not just that, but that what your own experience and who you are is important. You don't have to make a film about somebody famous. That isn't what makes films necessarily good. It's a personal documentary, as Phil was mentioning earlier, that George taught me, so that there's something very universal in the particular.
Yeah, I just want to sort of add to that, as it comes back, and and I want to sort of relate it to the student's point of view. Once again, this phenomena that I have in my head is just hearing Rick say that again. It's like, I remember that talk 35, 40 years ago. It's very familiar, and it's the same rap, the same thing. And I'm guessing, and maybe I'll just, I won't generalize, but I'll guess, but I, for one, just a typical Southern Ontario small town guy, came to Sheridan College looking for largely, a bit of a skill trade, but I was never worried about making a living. I've been making a living since I've been 16. So it wasn't a career, but what I was looking for, and I'm sure many of my colleagues, the same thing, was looking for an identity, something to be different than your peer group in your hometown. I just didn't want to be like the guys that I grew up with. That was another culture. So I wanted to be different. That's all I wanted. I wanted identity. I knew a bit about photography that got me to film. And then my point is, you hear Rick talk in the second or third week about personal films, making a film about yourself, your world. Boy, that just makes sense. Why wouldn't you? Once again, knowing that you didn't want to write scripts and make theatrical films and all that nonsense, so it's once again this phenomena that a receptive student comes into a very convincing teacher. Boom. And it exploded in my case for 40 years,
No, that's great. Guess we're coming to time now. I wanted to get one question off to finish it. This is maybe more of a personal question for myself. But I'm sure Phil has a lot to say about it, but I'm wondering where you guys see small gauge film ending up over the next decade, like 8mm and 16mm. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on it, because I'm trying to set up a little film co-op here in St. Catharines, and I was just wondering your inputs on that sort of thing.
Well, it's going to continue because, I mean, I think it was maybe the mid 80s when I heard that video was going to take over, and then digital was going to take over from video, and then, and film would be just gone. And now the cost of a Bolex is really expensive. If you try to get it online, it used to be kind of a couple thousand. Now it's like up to 5,000 or 6,000, because there's a lot of people wanting to go back to this medium that you can touch with your hands. It's obviously a reaction against these screens. These co-ops and workshops are cropping up all over the world. Like, you can live a life in that. You don't have to join the club, join the corporation or whatever. But these, there's a series of labs all over the world that are connected, that are hand processing films, sharing knowledge. And it is an art. It's not, it's obviously not the kind of thing that we're seeing on, that there's a lot of money in it. But I think there's a lot of, what that may develop into something else. But I just think you just get a gang of people together and you start a workshop, and people want community now. That's what I'm finding too. And that's part of what the Film Farm is. People want to go somewhere and be together with someone in a different kind of situation and not just look at screens. There's the whole thing with plant processing and all that gets us close to what we live in, which is an environment like that. So I think it is a reaction to the screen life.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well from what you've told me, Phil, and from what I've read, and how people, young people especially, are quite interested in analog, almost as if it's a new phenomenon, and you kind of wonder if digital had been invented first and then analog came along, it would have been hailed as a great new invention. Look, a film, you can look up and you can actually see the image on it. So it's just the idea that progress is just we inevitably move forward, and whatever is new is better isn't necessarily true. And I think that story you told us, Richard, about picking the needle up on that record again and again. I mean, what could be more analog than that? I mean, that, you know, your feeling, your physicality comes right through in that kind of those kinds of techniques, and it shows in the film. I think, anyway.
Yeah, I don't know.
And look at your weavings, Richard. I mean, these are also very analog and very sculptural. With like the one you have behind you there, this is something that is also one of the reasons perhaps they're so successful is because they are very analog in a digital era.
Hey, once again, it's practical. I needed a stay-at-home project, you know?
I'm so glad you pointed out that background. I was going to ask Richard about it. Thank you, Rick.
That's I have to replace the weaving I have at Innis College.
Okay.
It's all faded, and you know, it's so I have to go in and do a major repair job this spring. So
Oh,
I'm laying it out here.
fantastic.
But just don't digitize it.
No.
It doesn't last forever.
I want to thank you for a fantastic conversation. Very, very personal, very on the mark. Connor, thank you for organizing it, and thanks to everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Connor. Good questions. Nice to see everybody.
Yeah, it's great to see this.
Such a lovely conversation. Some good jokes in there. You did make me laugh a little bit. And thank you, Connor, for bringing this fabulous program together. Connor's program will be available on the Vtape website, vtape.org, for those who aren't too sick of the screen for the next week. Please watch it again and again and pass it on to a friend.
Absolutely.